Hello and welcome. In this video, I want to take a look at the changes for the forces of the Death Guard in terms of the new data slate and the points update that have come out with the latest chapter approved known as Warzone Nephilim. These changes for the most part have been incredibly good to the Death Guard, and I think they're definitely going to come out way better than they were before and give you way more diversity within your list builds than you were previously capable of. Though some of the changes, such as the universal changes for how command points work, is definitely going to hurt them, as while Death Guard did not have an intensive pre-game spend in terms of the different relics and warlord traits that it used, they definitely did have a decent amount of them that they wanted to include, especially when you consider things like Revolting Stench Vats and things like Arc Contaminator, so you definitely end up in a bit of a situation where it's a little bit hard to get everything you used to before, but I think you'll still have a pretty easy time of narrowing down a combination of 3 relics and traits that you really want, so that you can build your list as efficiently as you want and tailor it to your game plan. Not only that, but Death Guard does have plenty of different ways of kind of utilizing their different resources without necessarily relying on different relics and traits, so they do have a lot of ability to kind of get around their usage of those things. Not only that, but Death Guard tend to be a little bit less of a command point hungry army early on in the game, so they definitely have a little bit of ability to kind of wait and recoup some of those command points before having to really invest them in different stratagems, though still seeing a rather large reduction of those command points does hurt some of your ability to use some of those more expensive stratagems, such as the ones that make your Terminators a little more durable. That being said, that kind of covers most of the general changes to them, as they still retain things like Armor of Contempt within the new data slate, and their Terminators, both the Blight Lords and Death Shroud, still retained their added objective secured ability, so they definitely have a home within the game. And I don't think Terminators are going to be cut out of different lists, though I do think they have a lot more competition now because of some of the points changes. With that being said, that covers pretty much all of the rules changes and data slate changes that the Death Guard have experienced since we last took a look at them, and I do think they're going to be rather okay, because while it's a little bit of a bummer to kind of lose some of those traits and relics that you normally took before, you're still going to be able to include enough of them to kind of get the majority of what you were getting before, and you'll also be able to kind of tailor your list using some of these other abilities. Not only that, but the points changes for the Death Guard forces have incredibly benefited them to the point that I do think they overshadow the command point changes, so let's take a look at the different point changes that the Death Guard experienced. To begin with the points changes, we'll kind of go down the codex and look at the different units that saw a points reduction. The first type within the codex is the HQ slot, and the only HQ slot that saw a decrease within its points cost was the Malignant Playcaster. The Malignant Playcaster went down by 5 points, going from 95 points to 90 points total. This isn't a particularly major decrease, though it's one that makes the cheapest unique Death Guard HQ choice a little bit cheaper and a little easier to include, which is always nice because Death Guard don't really have any cheap HQ choices that are unique to their faction. So this is definitely a nice little change, though the Malignant Playcaster is still a rather expensive option, however any little bit helps. That being said, even though the points change isn't particularly massive, it does add up, especially when you see all of the other points changes that occurred, so if this was the only unit that saw a points change, it definitely would have been a lot less exciting, though considering how many other points changes they received, it's definitely going to contribute to the overall points drop of any list that was built prior. Now, one other points change that occurred that heavily affects the HQ slot, though isn't really restrictive to HQ specifically, is the different deadly pathogens. All of the deadly pathogens have gone down by 5 points, making them all the better, and while you already saw some of them being played, such as Viscous Death on the Foul Blight spawn, I think they're all the better now, and they're definitely going to be considered a lot more now, simply because they're reaching a low enough points threshold where they become interesting on different characters. In addition to that, with the restriction of command points in pre-game spending, you're definitely going to start looking more towards abilities such as this to kind of bolster some of your characters so that you can get away with less relics and traits within your army. And with that being said, considering how many points drops the Death Guard experienced, you now have all the more ability to buy some of those low-cost deadly pathogens, which do give you that nice point of additional strength to really take some of your characters to the next level, though I do think they're still kind of just a nice pool of little abilities to play around with, and not really something you're going to really build your army around, considering that they all kind of do a little bit of a marginal thing, and don't really make you want to skew your list in any specific way. That's completely fine, and that's kind of a good ability to have, as it gives you that option to kind of include it, but it doesn't really force you into including that option specifically. Moving on from the HQ choice, we come to the troop choice within Death Guard forces, and the troop choice has probably seen the biggest changes for the different Death Guard units. The first change that it has seen is that the Poxwalkers have gone down by 1 point, going back down to 5 points per model, instead of being 6 points per model. This is a nice change, as the Poxwalkers were hurt a little bit by the cost increase, considering they're pretty much a fragile unit that really benefits from being taken in large numbers and having access to some of the different stratagems that they can utilize. And some of the other changes definitely make them less interesting, and they still do have a lot of problems, such as being very fragile and being very slow even for the Death Guard forces. Though with that being said, considering they're only 5 points a model and 20 models is only 100 points, there's definitely a lot of room to include a unit or two of Poxwalkers within various list builds, and I do think they're still going to stick around, as they were seeing play before, even with their points increase in mind, and I do think they're interesting enough for what they do to continue seeing play. The next change that occurred is the biggest one for this update, which is the change to the basic Plague Marines. The basic Plague Marines did not see a points cost in themselves, but now all of their war gear options for the Plague Marines have been reduced in cost, which means all of a sudden each of those weapons is free to take on your Plague Marine squads. This can give you pretty much a points reduction of roughly 10 points per model, considering how many different war gear options there are. Now think about it this way, not only do you have access to this war gear, but you can equip your squads in many different ways, and it definitely increases your options when building a unit of Plague Marines. On one hand, you can do something like taking a unit of 10 Plague Marines, and then arming 2 Plague Marines with Great Cleavers, 2 Plague Marines with Flails of Corruptions, and 2 Plague Marines with Maces of Contagion. Then you can use something like Haze of Corruption to really make them put out some incredible damage within melee combat. And if you're fine with one retaining a bolter, you can even give that Plague Marine a Sigil of Decay to cause a little bit of mortal wound output. You can throw a Power Fist on the Plague Marine champion, and you can even give him a Plasma Pistol while giving that unit some additional output by throwing in something like 2 Blight Launchers because they're free and you might as well. This makes an incredibly powerful melee unit that can do quite a lot of damage when encountering an enemy. It has a lot of durability with Armor of Contempt and all the other Death Guard benefits, so it's definitely something that can be a really terrifying unit on the battlefield. Now inversely, you can also think about a shooting unit, such as taking a unit of 5 Plague Marines, throwing a Plasma Gun on one of the Marines, a Plague Launcher on the other Marine, and then throwing a Plasma Gun on the Plague Marine champion. This gives you some decent output, and then you can even throw something like a Flail of Corruption on the 4th Plague Marine, simply to give yourself some ability to fight your way out of combat if you ever get collapsed on and the unit gets trapped within combat. Why would you go with a 5-man unit instead of a 10-man unit? Well, if you take 2 5-man units instead of 1 10-man unit, you get an additional plasma gun on the champion of that second unit. So this way you end up with 4 plasma guns and 2 blight launchers across 10 different Marines, instead of a situation where you have 3 plasma guns and 2 blight launchers on a unit of 10 Marines. There's definitely a whole lot of different ways you can build these units, and there's a ton of different options that you can play around with now that all of the war gear is free, so it gives you a ton of customization and a ton of different ways of playing those Plague Marine units. I definitely think this is an incredible change. Even though it might be a little too good in terms of power level, I think it's something that's going to be a lot of fun to play around with. Though do keep in mind, if you're building an army now, that in 3 months or 6 months time, this might be going away, so there might be some situations where you end up with some units that you don't really want to use in future situations, as we've seen changes like this in the past, that ended up being reverted going into a new edition or into a new meta format. So do keep that in mind, and if you're going to go with something like extreme builds for your Plague Marines, do consider magnetizing some of their arms whenever it's possible so that you can kind of get away with swapping them back to their bolters once these rules are changed, if they're ever changed, because I do think they're incredibly powerful and I do think they might create some issues. Though on the other hand, I do think they're going to be a ton of fun to play around with, and I do think this is one of those changes that really gives you a lot of different options and gives you a lot of ability to have a lot of fun, and I do want to see more of this kind of thing from Games Workshop as opposed to kind of a reduction of what choices you can have by means of points. I do understand it's incredibly hard to balance, so in the future maybe they can make some of the weaker options free so that you can just kind of throw them in the unit. Though if you have some options that are free and some options that cost points, you end up in the situation that you're kind of forced into one or the other, and that's never exactly a fun place to be, as it kind of cuts out that optionality that I was praising for this change in the first place. Anyway, I definitely think the Plague Marines are definitely the biggest winner of this points change and of the data slate changes, as all of a sudden they've gained a decent amount of durability thanks to Armor of Contempt, as they were already incredibly durable, and now they have an incredible array of weapon options that makes them incredibly powerful, essentially taking every Plague Marine from 30 points and reducing them down to their base cost once you take the points off for their special weapons. Definitely a huge change, definitely a big power level spike, and one that probably Death Guard could have used, as they were kind of a middle of the pack army that generally did just okay but kind of needed a bit of a push to be competitive at the very top levels. Looking at the changes to the elite slot within the Death Guard forces, the changes are rather minimal, though most of the elite choices didn't really need much help, as they were already incredibly good units, though the changes that they did make are reasonable enough in themselves. the first change was to the Terminator units, with Blight Lords going down by 2 points a model, now costing 40 points a model, and Death Shroud Terminators going down by 5 points a model, leaving them at 50 points per model. These changes are perfectly fine, and the Terminator units didn't really need much help at all as they were already incredible units, though this probably just helps them compete a little more with those new and improved Plague Marines. I don't think the Terminators are really going anywhere, considering they still have the ability to teleport strike in, and it's a little harder to get units into reserve with the pre-game command point spending, making teleport strike all the more enticing. Not only that, but the durability and the output of the Terminators is incredibly powerful and surpasses that of the Plague Marines in many cases, even with their new free war gear options. Though that being said, the Terminators definitely now have competition from the Plague Marines within their forces, but I still think you're going to see them within different Death Guard lists, as they're just perfectly good options, and the minor points reduction to both the Terminators does help them be included within lists. And don't forget, all these different points reductions are going to add up at the end of the day to make it even easier to include more stuff within your army than you did before. And the only other change within the Elite slot that the Death Guard saw was the reduction of points of the Hellbrute by 10 points, bringing it down to a total of 105 points per Hellbrute. This isn't the worst change in the world, but I don't think it's one that's really going to make people play the Hellbrute any more than they played it before, though the Hellbrute did make occasional appearances within lists, usually as a one-off in some very niche situations. That being said, I still think you're probably going to overlook it for things like the Folded Variants and the Terminators, as they're just generally going to be more interesting units for your army composition. Not to mention that changes within other parts of the Death Guard forces do still make you want to take other options over the Hellbrute in most situations, so you're not probably going to see any more of them than you did before, which means this change is pretty much moot, but who knows, maybe you'll see one or two more of them than you normally did before, which isn't a bad outcome to have. And it's not really a unit you cared about making particularly amazing, as Death Guard have so many other options that kind of having this generic Hellbrute isn't going to really make you change how you build your list. I will say the one thing I kind of don't like about these changes in terms of points for elites is that the Death Guard Possessed didn't see any change to their points. And this is probably a good opportunity to kind of discuss the Terminus S Assault forces, because I still think the Terminus S Assault is fine where it is. If anything, it's gotten a lot better because of the Plague Marines being better. And not only the Plague Marines getting better, but also the Poxwalkers getting better, as well as the Terminators, makes the Terminus S Assault Force all the more powerful. Not to mention that Typhus is a rather strong character, that if I'm remembering the wording correctly of the rule, gets a free Warlord trait when he buys his first initial Warlord trait. That's a nice little perk to have, especially in the reduced pre-game spending. Though that being said, their Assault ability, that essentially lets you deep strike units out of strategic reserves, definitely has gotten weaker because of its inflated command point cost and the reduction of starting command points. So that's definitely a little bit of a hit against it, but I think it has enough tools to kind of compete regardless, and I think it's going to be fine enough with all the different goodies it got and things like the Plague Marines to not really be out of the meta. Though I do think it's gone a little bit weaker compared to a traditional Death Guard list, and we'll see why shortly when we look at the other unit type slots within Death Guard forces. So with that being said, that's kind of the conclusion to Terminus S. I think it's fine, I think you're still going to see it, and I think it's gotten a boost in power level, so it's definitely better than it was before. It's just that it's probably not as exciting as it maybe was before some of the changes because of the pre-game command point spending and some of the additional relics and traits that it offered you. That being said, I don't think it's going anywhere from the meta anyway, so I think it's definitely going to be something where you just make the choice of whether or not you play it, and that's definitely good for the variety of Death Guard lists that you're going to see within the metagame as a whole. The fast attack choices that were primarily used within the Death Guard forces have seen a points reduction as well, with the Photo Blow Drone seeing a points cost cut of 15 points going down to a total of 115 points, and definitely edging out the Hellbrute in terms of playability. The Photo Blow Drone is definitely a very powerful unit, and one that is very good when equipped with the Flesh Mower, as well as being perfectly fine with other options as well, as it's a rather fast moving unit for the Death Guard forces that might have some mobility issues in other circumstances, so it definitely offers not only a very good melee output, but it also offers some additional mobility that the Death Guard might struggle to find in other places. It's definitely a perfectly good model to include within your army, and one that many forces of the Death Guard will really enjoy including, and now with the reduced points cost, it's much easier to include them within your list. The other fast attack choice, the Mephitic Blight Hauler, did see a points cut cost as well, going down only 10 points to a total of 120 points per model. This might be a little bit confusing as the Mephitic Blight Hauler is definitely weaker than the Photo Blow Drone in terms of its power within a Death Guard list. Though with that being said, do keep in mind that the Photo Blow Drone is restricted to one model per unit, making it hard to get a critical mass of Photo Blow Drones within an army, and it kind of forces you to build a fast attack slot in a certain style if you want your maximum access to the photo bloat drones. And in comparison to that, the Mephitic Blight Hauler can be taken on larger units, making it easier to get a critical mass of Mephitic Blight Haulers, thus the points have to be a little higher on the Blight Haulers in order to compensate for your ability to take them in larger sized units. This definitely seems like the right points cost for both these units, and I think they're both very playable, as both of them have seen play throughout different Death Guard lists, and I think with all the points changes, the Mephitic Blight Hauler is definitely a very interesting inclusion in many lists that maybe shied away from it in the past. Though with that being said, this does also make the vehicle list for the Death Guard forces more interesting. However, it's now harder to take something like an Outrider detachment simply because you're restricted to those starting command points, which definitely does hurt the playability of some of these options in that sense, but I think you're still going to see them plenty on the tabletop, and I think their points are pretty much where they need to be. Moving along from the fast attack choice, we come to the heavy support choice. The heavy support choice saw a lot of reductions, though the one that's the most important is the Plaguebearer's Crawler, going down a total of 15 points from 150 points to 135 points. And this is a fine enough change, and one that's probably there to compensate for some of the changes to how the indirect fire rules work, considering the Plaguebearer's Crawler did see a bit of a nerf when the indirect fire rules were changed. And that being said, the indirect fire rules didn't really hurt it that much, considering that the entropy cannons on the Plaguebearer's Crawler hit incredibly hard, and the mortar is fine enough in direct line of fire, considering how hard it can hit in addition to its entropy cannons. Not to mention that the Plaguebearer's Crawler has insane durability, so really it was seeing a perfect amount of play even with the changes to indirect fire, and it was still showing up in many of the Death Guard lists. Though that being said, the points reduction is definitely welcome, and it kind of just contributes to the overall points reduction in the various Death Guard forces, thus making you able to take a lot more different units within a list instead of kind of always feeling kind of tight on points. So it's nice to see that all of the good units kind of saw points reduction so that you don't feel like you're kind of forced into taking one unit or another just because it's a much bigger points reduction than another unit, meaning that you still have plenty of options within the Death Guard list, meaning that you have pretty much access to so many points, so much so that many people have said that their list has dropped something like 300 points as a result of some of these changes, which is pretty insane and gives you so much more to work with. Not only does it give you those additional points to work with, but now a lot of your choices are cheaper as well, and a lot of your units can be made incredibly powerful with the points reductions that you see. So I definitely think it's going to mitigate most of the changes to the command point reduction, and you'll still have plenty of options and still plenty of ability to build a very powerful Death Guard list. I think Death Guard is definitely a huge winner of these changes, but these aren't all of the changes. The Death Guard forces did see a couple other changes in their heavy support slot, with the Land Raider going down by 20 points to a total of 245 points. The Land Raider kind of didn't see any play, and I did see one game of it where someone brought it to a tournament, and let's just say it didn't end very well. Mostly the problem is it's a little too fragile and a little too expensive for what it does, so it does have a lot of issues in that regard. That being said, maybe if it gets to a low enough points cost, maybe if it was 200 points, it would be a lot easier to include into a list and have a little bit more playability. Though really the problem is the durability of the Land Raider, which does really kind of make it hard to include into a list unless it's incredibly undercosted, and then it just kind of becomes a thing where you just include a bunch of them simply because it's a cheap enough points unit. So really it would have been nice to see them kind of find a new way of making the Land Raider a little more playable, which maybe they did because rumors say that the new Land Raiders are toughness 9. Though even then I have to wonder, is that really going to make it a valuable enough option, or does it need some kind of special rules to reflect kind of how much of a siege engine it is? The only other change to the heavy support slot was that both the Chaos Predator Annihilator and the Chaos Predator Destructor saw a points cost. The Annihilator went down by 15 points, now costing a total of 115 points, and the Destructor went down by a total of 10 points, now costing 130 points. That's fine and all, but I still don't think you're really going to be compelled to play either of these over the Plaguebearer's Crawler, which still competes with them in points cost very effectively, and brings you a much more interesting set of weapons, as well as having a ton more durability. I think you're ultimately going to see more Land Raiders than you're going to see Predators within Death Guard lists, which is a bit of a shame, as the Predator tanks are something that was kind of an iconic tank within the early days of Warhammer 40k, so it's kind of sad to see them shelved so heavily. However, something like the Plaguebearer's Crawler is a much more unique vehicle and much more representative of what the Death Guard are than the Predator tanks, so I guess that makes it a little more okay. And I guess maybe at some point we'll see the Predator tanks kind of rotate out of some of these Chaos side factions and be replaced by things that are more unique to that faction in itself. Anyway, I don't know really how to feel about that, but I guess it's positive overall, as ultimately it makes things a little more unique and gives you a little more reason to kind of differentiate the different Chaos forces, and include different chaos factions with one another, as opposed to kind of having a samey feeling when you have too many vehicles and too many special units that are kind of replicated throughout the different codexes. They make the faction feel a little bit diluted at times. And finally, the last change that the Death Guard forces experience within the points drop is that Mortarion went down by a total of 40 points, going from 490 points to 450 points. That's definitely a massive points cost, and Mortarion is a very impressive model that saw a whole lot of play in the past, so he can definitely make a return and see a lot more play in the meta, though he can be a little bit fragile at times, and he can kind of go down before he has big enough impact on the game itself. Though that being said, he's definitely a beautiful model and a big powerhouse when he can be effective on the table, and with all the different points cost that the Death Guard saw, as well as the massive points cost that Mortarion saw within this change, I definitely think he's going to be showing up a little bit more, and maybe he'll show up on different mixed lists like he did before, featured alongside other Chaos monsters such as Renegade Knights, and even things like Abaddon the Despoiler, who supposedly is incredibly powerful within the new Chaos Codex that's coming out. It would be kind of cool to see that kind of build again, as there was a time where you would see Mortarion with some Chaos Knights and some other choices. Though the pregame command point spending to have multiple detachments is definitely a lot harder, so you might just see him sticking to pure Death Guard lists, and that's fine as well, as long as he starts seeing more of a role in the meta, considering he kind of fell out of it as new armies were released, whereas he was very popular when he was initially released. So it would be good to see him kind of cycle back in, and maybe not be a dominant force within the meta, but one that people have to kind of consider and people want to play when building a Death Guard list. That being said, I guess it's time to kind of go with the closing thoughts in terms of where Death Guard are within the greater scope of Warhammer 40k. I definitely think the Death Guard were a big winner within these different changes. They didn't really lose anything, and they've been getting consistent buffs throughout the different data slates, which definitely made them a lot better and a lot more interesting. And I definitely think the changes to Plague Marines gives you so much ability to play around with the different variety of different options that you have. Not only that, but the Terminus S remains something that's playable, though it definitely kind of hurts not being able to include Mortarion, as well as not being able to include some of the vehicles, which saw a big points drop. However, the Terminators did see a points reduction as well, and the Plague Marines have so many different goodies that you can definitely build a very interesting Terminus S list with the inclusion of their new ability to carry quite a ton of different special weapons. The Poxwalkers also help a little bit too, as Terminus S list definitely include a good enough number of Poxwalkers for the point reduction to kind of start adding up and to start mattering in combination with the points reduction seen on other units. I do think there are a few small misses, such as the Chaos Possessed not going down in points, and some of the weaker folded Varions not seeing a bit of a points reduction as well. Though that being said, that's a bit of a nitpick considering how good the rest of the changes were, so I can't really be upset with those changes too much, as you're definitely encouraged to play quite a lot of different units, as you definitely have reasons to play Terminus S, and you definitely have reasons to play vehicles, and you have more incentive to play some units that were less popular, such as Mortarion and Plague Marines with special weapons, and who knows, maybe you might even see more Land Raiders, considering all the points reduction that the Death Guard saw as a whole, as well as the points reduction to a Land Raider. And all of that being said, I do think Death Guard are positioned to be a very powerful army within the meta in this upcoming chapter approved. One thing I'll say is that a lot of other armies did definitely gain a power boost as well, so remember the greater context of the changes for the Death Guard, as other armies will be able to compete with them as well, with all the changes that they received. Though at the same time, some of the best armies definitely saw a reduction in their power, which does make Death Guard better in that sense as well. One issue that the Death Guard still have is that they are generally very slow, and you're definitely going to have some situations where that does really hurt you, because you're going to have a much harder time getting on some of those objectives, or engaging with your enemy forces before they can really take advantage of your lacking mobility. Though that being said, I do think the Death Guard have enough tools to kind of really put up a fight against almost any army. However, if you build your list skewed too much in one direction, you definitely will struggle against certain builds, so do keep in mind when building your list how you can make it to take on a variety of different armies, especially now that things like Knights are very popular within the meta, and Death Guard don't necessarily have an amazing amount of heavy firepower. However, something like the Plague Burst Crawler can definitely put a lot of damage into a lot of Knights while withstanding a decent amount of their firepower. Anyway, let me know what you think of these changes, let me know in the comments down below, and do you think I overlooked anything or made any errors within this video? What do you think is probably the most interesting change to the Death Guard forces? Do you agree with me that it's the Plague Marine changes? Or do you think something like the Mephitic Blade Haulers, being cheap enough now to be taken in large quantities, is more interesting than taking a bunch of Plague Marines? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, as always, thank you for watching, and as always, I want to give a big shout out to my patrons. You guys are really awesome people and really do help support the channel. In addition to that, I would like to say, if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share this video with them, as it not only helps the channel, but it also helps them out as well. And if you've enjoyed the content, do subscribe and like for future videos from this channel. Thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.